Hello amateurs, welcome to another episode of the Amateur Rugby Podcast, here to help soothe your Sunday morning hangover with some wonderful rugby chat about the grassroots of the game. I'm your host Tim, and I've got another amazing guest for you today. He's worked with some of the best teams and athletes of the modern era. He's a specialist in strength and conditioning, and he's here today to share some of that incredible experience with you. Please welcome Mr. Chris Toombs. Chris, how are you?
Well, Tim, thanks ever so much for the introduction and the invitation. I'm very well, thank you. Excited to talk to you, really, and you've bigged it up. So hopefully, I can repay that fanfare. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. No worries. Now, just as I said in the intro, there you're an S&C coach. So, just what have you been up to today so far, just to give people a sort of an idea of what you do?
I have. So basically, now in my world now, you've caught me by surprise here. I work predominantly in the online space, but do have athlete-facing coaching responsibilities as well. So I'm head of performance at SW7 Academy. So my morning has actually been head in the laptop, couple of calls, looking at some prospective opportunities and some programming essentially online. That's been the morning so far. I'm hoping the dog doesn't bark too much within the podcast. But I guess in my past life, to give you a little bit of context, I've been 28 years in performance coaching in the health and fitness and professional rugby predominantly. Leicester Tigers going back to 2002, which is many moons ago, but hopefully we can dive into some of those players you alluded to in the intro. Cardiff Blues for a long time as well, nearly 10 years, and that's how I met SW7 founder Sam Warburton. And essentially, we have a story around what I call the cub to lion. So I work with Sam as an academy player and others, all the way through to when he made his Lions debut in 2013. So we've got a nice little story to share around that. I've dipped my toe into professional rugby in North America. I've worked in Major League Rugby, and we can maybe dive into some of the things that go on in Major League Rugby. I work for the Seattle Seawolves in Seattle. And now I've landed in sunny South Wales, and Sam and I have got back together to sort of drive SW7 Academy forward with some founding partners and some other staff as well. So it's an exciting journey, and it really is. And hopefully we'll obviously spend a bit of time maybe going down that little rabbit hole too. But Tim, the floor is obviously open. I'm a very transparent human. I love telling some stories of yesteryear. We've got some characters within professional rugby, as you can imagine. So hopefully we can dive into some of that on memory lane.
Absolutely. There is so much to get into there. But as always, I like to start at the beginning. So what's your rugby history? How did you first get involved in the game?
Yeah, so going back many, many moons, I was very fortunate, I suppose, in some respects. My dad was a consulting civil engineer, and we travelled, relatively speaking, the world as a young boy. I got into rugby in South Africa. So I grew up in apartheid South Africa, which is giving my age away a little bit, where I guess the pathway that you took as a schoolboy in South Africa was pretty much rugby in the winter, cricket in the summer. So I got exposed to rugby, I think, as a 12 or 13-year-old, and was instantly hooked. I ended up coming back to the UK to finish my education and graduate and do all those things. But so I'll give you 83, I think I was introduced to rugby. And I've been involved ever since. I'm now coach at grassroots level as well. So my son's playing under 12s. He's a number 9, so he loves Anton Dupont and Aaron Smith, which are two good role models in my opinion. But so I coach rugby at grassroots level now. But I got into it at school in South Africa and loved it ever since.
Amazing. So tell me about that experience in South Africa. Were you on the hard pitches? Was it that kind of South African rugby?
I was, yes, absolutely. So I grew up in Johannesburg, or when I went to school in Johannesburg. The pitches were like a road. They really were. I think the best memory I have, well, two memories. One, sadly, I broke my leg playing relatively soon into my rugby career, but it didn't put me off. I was a 13-year-old. I remember having the plaster cast on and all that sort of stuff. But I also remember, Tim, the grass burns were absolutely horrendous. And you'd literally have the bed sheet sticking to your legs in the night where you've had those big, great, literally the South African pitches were that straw colour, super hard. It was, I never really thought about, wow, I'm literally playing on concrete. But when I look back, I think jeepers, that is probably not now in the world of health and safety a pitch that would ever be allowed to be played on. But back in those days, it was just like nice and dry. Ball was that really thick, heavy leather. They weighed a blooming ton. But this is going back a long, long time, 40 years. So, but it was great. Really, really, really enjoyed it. It's actually 40 this year, 83, yeah. So,
Wow.
yeah, rugby's been in my blood since then.
And were you aware of the political situation at the time? Was that something that you were kind of au fait with, or what happened there?
Yeah, no, relatively speaking, I mean, in terms of segregation, for example, you'd go to, say, your Durbans down on the coast for a family break or what have you, and there's the white and black segregation on beaches, for example. I mean, most of the people in my neighbourhood had servants and staff who were obviously coloured. I mean, we were a British family who didn't necessarily want to go down that road in terms of how we lived our everyday life. But no, without a doubt, there was definitely a kind of a awareness of the political kind of situation, but not necessarily when it came to. I think there's only two channels on TV, for example. You had an English speaking channel and you had an Afrikaans speaking channel. So it wasn't like you were in this day and age bombarded with news on social media platforms and all the kind of information that we have now. That kind of tsunami of information wasn't there, but I was certainly aware of it.
Yeah. So do you still carry like a warmth for South Africa? And if so, what are your feelings around them winning a back-to-back World Cups?
Yeah, funny you should say that, because I do, but I mean, I was there 4 to 5 years during my, like I say, it did shape the way I've kind of ended up in my life, because rugby and cricket are two things that have been part of my kind of professional life for so long, but also my kind of personal life in terms of I played cricket at a reasonably high level. So South Africa, even over 3 or 4 or 5 years, had a profound effect on my life and the journey that I've taken since. So yeah, I was pleased for them. I understand the cultural kind of evolution they've gone through from when Pienaar won in '95 with his group, and then obviously back to back with the current crop of players who I do have an appreciation for the underlying challenges within the country. I mean, I lived in Cape Town after university and I played cricket down there, and it's one of my favourite places in the world. But you can't be lost on the political significance of South Africa winning with such a multicultural team now. But also, I think the DNA of South African rugby, for me, if I'm being brutally honest, is about physical domination and intimidation still, even though there's much more scrutiny around contact and all the nuances of the game and player safety, which I totally uphold and respect. I think they still, man-to-man challenge are, I'm going route one first, do something about it. And obviously that forward power. Look at the way they put their bench together. A 7-1 split. I mean, educated gambling in terms of Razzie and the coaching group. Because if Faf de Klerk had got injured in the first 2 minutes of the game, it could have been very, very interesting. But anyway, that's what fascinates me about the sport in general still. But also, there is that kind of, the South African DNA is tough, abrasive, direct sports players who I don't think they lose very well, and I don't think they win very well either. But, that's me just being honest. But they also have they're now the first team ever to win 4 World Cups. So there's rugby in their blood, there's rugby in their history, and they did it the hard way, Tim. Look at them. I mean, we talked off air. To win a quarterfinal, a semi-final, and a final by a single point is the closest it could have ever been. And they've been rewarded with 4 years of, current world champions. So it's been an incredible ride for them. And one of my mates is the head of performance there. So I'm extremely happy for him too.
Okay, that's amazing.
Sorry, that went on and on, but you did ask.
It's a great answer. We've alluded to it a few times here about your day job in terms of S&C. How and why did you first get into S&C, Chris?
I'm sure you've heard this before, Tim, and if you haven't, you will now. Probably a failed sportsman. So I guess, in short, ambitions not to play rugby professionally, believe it or not. I had ambitions to play cricket professionally, and I chose a university after my A-levels. I chose a university that I hoped would further my ambitions in terms of me playing cricket at a decent level. So I went to Leeds Metropolitan University, it's now Leeds Beckett, studied sport and exercise science and human movement studies with one eye on furthering my cricket ambitions, but also getting some education at the same time. Once I kind of exhausted the opportunity to play at high level, I played reasonably high level, but once I knew that professional cricket wasn't going to be a vocation for me, the next best thing for me was always about coaching and about being the health, the fitness, the performance side of supporting players in their ambitions. And I think I fell into it. I don't think when I started in my journey as a strength and conditioning coach, there was no strength and conditioning degrees. There was no the expansion of strength and conditioning has gone exponential over the last 10, 15 years, particularly. So when I started, there was no pathway to strength and conditioning. It was human movement studies and it was sport and exercise science. So I went down that road, and then things evolved outside of once I'd left university and once cricket had kind of been put on the sidelines. I actually retired from playing club rugby in 1994 because I was a personal trainer at the time in London. I just started working, and I think I went to work one Monday and my shoulder was hanging off, and everyone gets injured in rugby. It's one of the kind of costs of doing business. But anyway, at that point in time, I thought, well, if I'm going to make a career in coaching others, then in terms of demonstrations and in terms of being active enough to, show you, Tim, this is a push press, this is a dumbbell snatch. Well, with one shoulder incapable of actually you doing that at the time, I was like, do you know what? I've got to let my social rugby ambitions go and just get on with the coaching side of my life. And then since then, like I say, 94, 95, I've just kind of focused on delivering support services to players who've got ambitions to play at the highest level. Fortunate for me, like I said, from my little diatribe at the beginning, I've worked in professional rugby in England, Wales and America, and I'm blessed to have met some phenomenal athletes and players, and I've helped some of them support their careers to, the highest of the high, which is, very humbling from a coach's standpoint.
For sure, absolutely. Now, a couple of things. Which club was it you were playing for? I'd love to know. And two, how difficult a decision was it to sort of give up on your amateur rugby?
Warlingham in Surrey was the club I used to play for. And how difficult? You know what, Tim? I didn't find it that hard. I did for a while miss. Of course, you miss the camaraderie, but I had a cricket team which kind of has not quite the same banter, but inevitably the changing room is a fun place to be. I did miss the collision element and that feeling on a Sunday, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be, recognize this. I actually did miss that kind of, oh my God, I've kind of been in a car crash, but survived it type mentality that a lot of collision sport athletes would have enjoyed. I did actually enjoy the physical side. I was a 9, so I wasn't exactly the world's best defender. I wasn't a back rower. But I did miss it for a while, but I wouldn't say it was kind of like, oh my God, I'm desperate to lace my boots up. I mean, when I watched from the sideline professional players colliding with each other, and part of my job was to make them better at that part of the game, I did watch and go, I just have enormous admiration for anyone still playing, whether that's grassroots level and of course at professional level, psychologically preparing for that confrontation week in, week out is incredibly challenging. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, you mentioned there about the qualifications that you went through initially, and how there's way more now, I'm sure. But also, I'm really interested in that almost like the history of rugby strength and conditioning, because just thinking back to when I started, sort of in the sort of mid 90s, senior rugby, I guess, that there wasn't any really. That it was go to the gym and pick up some stuff. Basically, that was kind of how it went.
Totally, and I think that may,
like the major trends over the years, Chris. What have you seen?
No, I think, rugby turning professional in 1995, without a shadow of a doubt, was the kind of catalyst for the growth and development of support staffs and people getting looked after. But actually, funny you should say, because I actually had Craig White, who's a very legendary strength and conditioning coach, British and Irish Lions tourist twice, and Wasps and a few other teams at Wales. I had him on the SW7 Academy podcast actually last week, and we talked about the evolution of strength and conditioning to some degree. And I guess the 95 World Cup was the start of everyone having physios, one S&C, one physio, one coach. And then, as you know, from the World Cup this year, it's morphed into enormous support staffs of probably upwards of 20 with video analysts, multiple physios, multiple strength and conditioning coaches, heads of performance, position coaches and specialist coaches. And S&C has been no different. And actually, Craig was, I do believe, was very instrumental in enhancing the size of staff so that players got better care. And what I mean by that, so when I first started at Leicester Tigers, there were 3 S&C coaches, bearing in mind they had a very successful time winning 4 championships back-to-back and 2 Heineken Cups. I went in the year after, sadly, but it is what it is. But I was, at the beginning, tasked with leading the academy program, which had 60 players. And then there was 2 other coaches who had the senior program. And I spilled over into the senior program because there were 60 players in the senior program as well. So in terms of ratio, that Tim, you can do the math, 60 into 3 is 1 to 20 ratio. And as you can imagine, when rugby seasons start and they start smashing into each other and all that sort of stuff, you have a host of lads on the injury list. They need specific attention. They need individual attention. They need modifications. So 1 to 20 is actually a ratio that's probably too high to really service the athletes or the players really well. So I think trends-wise, someone like Craig White really fought for sort of 4, 5, 6 S&C coaches within your staff. So you've almost got a ratio of 1 to 8, 1 to 10 maybe. So then players are getting really well looked after with their support services. So I guess the trend is kind of going back the other way a little bit now, where staffs are a little bit leaner because of the cost implications. You can only look at the news to see, the 4 English teams, including Jersey, have kind of struggled financially in the last 12 months, particularly. So was something that really changed, where you'd have multiple staff members. You then have a multidisciplinary team that involves a lot of different stakeholders. And so it was an interesting challenge. I mean, Cardiff never had a really enormous staff. I mean, we had 3 S&C coaches, maybe 4, including the academy. But I know that teams in England at one point in time were having 6 or 7 S&C coaches, which means a lot of joined up communication. There's physios to talk to. There's heads of medical. It just support staffs get to a number where they're nearly as big as the playing group. So I think that trend is going to reverse itself a little bit, given the economic kind of climate in world rugby. I know the South Africans and the Kiwis, for example, they still have a relatively lean staff, and they have, I guess, systems in place to make it as effective and efficient as possible. But I guess more is not always better, but I think to some degree a certain number is optimal. But I guess that's the decision that every business has to make around staffing, right?
Yeah, for sure. Now, are you seeing, in terms of the players, are they more educated now when they get to the top level of the game in terms of their own S&C? Do a lot of them have a good idea of what they actually need to do themselves?
Great question, Tim. I think to some degree, yes. I think you've got for me, you've got two different type of players. You've got those who just want to take the thinking out of preparation and be directed in a good way, not led because they're blindly going into battle like sheep, but they've got enough, especially those who are relatively high profile now. They've got so many other things going on in their worlds. Some of them have got business interests. Some of them have obviously got sponsor commitments. They've got club commitments. They're high profile, and they've got other ambitions to work outside of the game, which I actually think is very admirable, to not wait till the end of your career. So a lot of players want just hit, what's my program? What am I doing today? Crack on and get busy. Others are much more thoughtful in terms of why we're doing this, why we're doing that. And I had some great conversations with players, especially those coming over from the Southern Hemisphere. When I was at Cardiff particularly, a lot of the Kiwi players would ask why quite often. And it was a nice coaching conversation to connect with players around why we're doing this, why we're doing that. How is that going to affect my performance? How is that going to affect the team's performance? And that was a nice situation that I found myself in, where you actually, in a good way, having to justify why something's in your program. And that also allows you to kind of audit your professional practice and take things out that actually are time consuming but have no real value to the output of the player, or the output of the result of the game whether it's now or whether it's in the future. So I mean, those conversations were really valuable, but that some couldn't care less. Some hated the gym, some loved running. It's like anything, isn't it? You got 50 guys in a squad. to 30 sit in the middle. You've got 10 outliers at either side. 5 or 6 guys probably don't want to do S&C but love playing, and they've got really high skill level. Then you've got 5 or 6 at the other end of the scale who love the gym, and actually I don't know why they don't want to play. It's like, hold on, you're a professional rugby player. You want to do the gym, but you don't want to play. And it's a weird and fantastic dynamic all in one thing, because I loved both ends of the spectrum. So I don't want to name names, but there was a scrum half at Cardiff who was a fantastic player. And actually, I will. His name's Jason Spice. I don't think he ever played for New Zealand. But Jason, I really like him. I still keep in touch with him now. I haven't been his coach for 15 years. But Jason was, I would say, one of the best on-field coaches the team's ever seen. But he hated the gym. But if you wanted, he's a 9, so his fitness was very, very important. Jason hated the gym, but you ask him to go and run repeat sprints outside or repeat shuttle runs and do things that he thought had an effect and an impact on his game, he'd be as compliant as you like. In the gym, you'd struggle to get a good half-hour session out of him. And ultimately, that's about the relationship. Yeah, but Tim, it's about making the relationship was about, give me 15 to 20 minutes, 30 minutes in the gym. This is going to help you from a resiliency standpoint, from a robustness standpoint, help you take some of that collision. But also, I'll happily, you want to do repeat speed with me outside, beautiful. That's what you think is going to improve your game. So it's a yin and yang, and it's a conversation, and it's what I call collective intelligence. It's adding the player's impact or input into the coaching input so that you get the best of the player. And that was a really good, strong lesson for me in terms of actually the players are really, really important. And I know this might sound obvious, but the players are really important in terms of asking them what they need to get better. So the second part of your question, as players went up the ladder and got to international level, I looked at myself and thought, actually, hold on a minute. Who am I? Who am I to challenge? I'll give you another name. Sorry to name drop. He's quite well known. Gethin Jenkins, 125 test caps for Wales. Arguably one of the most accomplished props in the game at that moment in time. Gethin and I didn't always see eye to eye on the way he wanted to prepare for competition. But I also accepted as a coach that Gethin at that point in time, maybe at that point, I can't remember, he had anywhere between 50 and 70 caps, just say. Who am I as a coach who's never played at international level, going to take his program or what he needs in his own mind to prepare for international rugby and totally reinvent it so that my ego gets served and the player doesn't get served? And I was like, hold on a minute, I've got to start listening more to the player group. And I left Gethin alone for the most part to get on with what he needed to do to play at the highest level for so many years. And Gethin, in his, not in his defence, but for the want of a better expression, Gethin was first in, last out. He was an ultimate professional. He looked after himself incredibly well. So who was I, like I say, to strip his program out of what he thinks he needs to service my kind of philosophy? And that was a really good lesson. And there's other examples of that, which would be exactly the same, where some players were like, I need this in my program, and you can take things out or add things in to suit their mindset and their ability. Xavier Rush was another great example. Xavier showed up week in, week out, one of the best signings Cardiff Blues, now Cardiff Rugby, have ever had in terms of an effective ball carrier. He brought his A game on the weekend. So he had a little bit of license during the week to, have a little bit more flexibility in his program, should we say. Other players needed to be directed. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. He liked to drink on a Tuesday night, maybe a Wednesday night, or maybe a Thursday night. But anyway, that's another story. But that you get, in my opinion, as a coach, you get paid on game day. Yes, you have to prepare diligently during the week. Of course you do, and you have to diligently prepare week after week after week. And certain players had a system that worked for them, and we molded to their system. We didn't impose our system on them, and I think that was very successful. And I think that's one thing, if there are young coaches listening, I would say the most important thing as a coach is listen to your player group, even if you're at a grassroots level. Players who are in the arena have of intellectual property to share. We have to listen to that and absorb that, and we have to make a decision accordingly. Yes, of course, at professional level, when winning at the weekend will come with, a cost in terms of pressure, newspaper articles, internet articles, coaching, credibility, all those things. Of course, you've got to factor all that in. But for the most part, the players are massively part and parcel of the developmental kind of pathway a team should take. And I know from my experiences, I've been into Saracens a fair few times, and I'm lucky to know a few people there. The player group there are extremely well versed and educated in their preparation kind of framework and how they go about their business, and it's very, very good to see, because they do take ownership of it, because then they take ownership of the performance of the weekend. Yes, of course, they've got coaching guidance, absolutely, but the reality is players who take ownership of their performance tend to perform better. It's no surprise.
Yeah, some really good points there. And some of these lessons have come sort of slightly later in your coaching journey. What was it like for you to go into Leicester Tigers, as you've already explained, incredibly successful Leicester Tigers at the time, and try and bring some ideas in terms of S&C? What was it like for you as a coach?
It was interesting. So I guess to go back to those days, I mean, this is a real true story. First day on the job, I'd gone through that process, or the first day back from summer break, 3 S&C coaches testing at Loughborough University. The first person to walk up to the jump mat, 6'9" or 6'8", Martin Johnson. So most people who know rugby know Martin Johnson's probably at that time would be one of the most famous players of all time at the time. And I look up. I'm lucky though, Tim. I'm 31. I'm not 21. So I've got a little bit more, I think, kind of about me when it comes to being a man and not a boy straight out of university. So I think that was the first thing that allowed me not to sort of cave to intimidation in the first instance. But I was also very fortunate that in my university years, I had shared some pub outings with a guy called Austin Healy, who was at the time, again, a relatively high-profile England player, known for his cheekiness, shall we say. And the fact that I knew Austin from university years was a kind of immediate icebreaker, because, yes, at that point in time, there was some seriously high-profile England players particularly, but also some overseas players of fair repute. But, yeah, going back to the story, the first person to the jump mat was Martin Johnson. So he introduced himself because he knew I was a new boy. I obviously knew who he was. But gets on the jump mat, not particularly athletic when it comes to jumping, if I'm honest, even though he's a line-out jumper. I know they lift in the line-out in this day and age. So he's anyway, it just went from there. I mean, the names could keep on coming. I mean, the household names I knew, but also it was a quite interesting time because there was a load of players who, within the depth of a squad, and it was the same when I was at Cardiff, there were players I didn't know who they were. I mean, there's some great guys, really personable people, good humans, but they're not in the public eye. You're not going to know every single person in the Leicester Tigers squad unless they're on the team sheet week in, week out. And there were some sort of level 2 or level 3 players who I didn't know who they were. So it was great to be able to test the whole battery of player, but the high-profile names I kind of knew, and then I had to get to know some of the sort of lesser-known players. But the whole squad dynamic was fascinating because all of the parts, all the component parts made up success. It wasn't just your England players who were superstars week in, week out. There's a South African guy who's a school teacher now, Glenn Gelderbloom, who played centre. Never, ever less than a 7 out of 10 performance standards-wise. Was always just literally Mr. Consistent. There's a prop called Derek Jelly, another one, who would never, ever let the team down when they got their opportunity. And then, of course, you had the big-timers. You had Neil Back, you had Julian White, you had XYZ players. So, but the component parts really worked. And I think the real team dynamic was genuine. I think there was a genuine kind of camaraderie and team spirit that was not manufactured. It was fascinating. But it wasn't daunting, Tim, because I think, like I said, I think I just had something about me as a 30-something-year-old as opposed to a 20-something. But when I look back at those years, it was like, jeepers, that was an unbelievable era to be involved in. But inevitably, the cost of winning cost people like Dean Richards their job back in the day. I mean, I think Leicester Tigers were used to top two, won the title 4 in a row, had just won back-to-back Heineken Cups, which at that point in time were the first team to ever do it. And then I think with the World Cup in 2003, they slid to about 6th in the table, and I think that was deemed not quite good enough for the senior leadership group at the time. And Dean Richards was replaced, and there was a little bit of kind of, I guess, transition and coaching change at that point in time. But it was brilliant to be exposed to such high-profile players, especially at that time when England had won Rugby World Cup 2003, and it was mayhem at the time. I mean, jeepers, they were superstars. Those 7 guys who went on to win in Australia were sort of week after week after week for months after the World Cup final were kind of Welford Road was bouncing. It was a great place to watch and enjoy rugby too.
Yeah, amazing. One of the names from that era that I'm really intrigued by, and especially with your sort of what input you could give to him, Darren Garforth. How did you improve him?
Mate, well, funny you should say that. So on the journey as a developing practitioner, I was very lucky that I was able to lead the sort of academy program, which was a bit more coach-led, shall we say, because they're developing players. I'll tell you now, Garforth, Graham Roundtree and Dorian West were probably the starting front row at that point in time. And going back to having a little bit of leeway when it came to preparing for game day, those three, actually Graham Roundtree, who's now coaching away at Munster, I believe, Graham was one of the best professionals I've ever come across in terms of diligence to prepare. Really, really diligent. Garforth and West would be found on a bike, probably Monday to Wednesday. They'd have Thursday off. They'd do the team run on Friday. They'd play Saturday. And I think that was, I mean, I take it as it's meant, Tim. It's kind of tongue in cheek. I got to them when they were at the latter end of their career and had played a gazillion times for the Tigers in the front row. And it's fairly attritional and it's fairly abrasive in terms of the position and the demands. They got away with rugby intellectual property and less training as they got older, and got away with kind of having a great understanding of the game and what they were good at. But I wouldn't say they trained like everybody else, that lot. But Garforth was a character. I mean, all 3 of those boys were characters, but they gnarly old front row of yesteryear. But I can't believe, Garforth. I tell you, the one who was the scariest, I think, in that era for me was Julian White. Never seen a stronger tight head to this day. Maybe Fal Felice, the Tongan who played at Cardiff for years. But Julian was super strong, farmer type strong. Pulling sleds around with like ridiculous weights, but not really traditionally in the gym strength. It was a strange one, but his leg strength was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, interesting. You've sort of kind of talked about the question I'm going to ask next just then, but I'm going to ask it anyway. These guys, getting towards the end of their career, don't need to train as much. So the question I want to ask is give me a little sort of talk about training age and how that then affects how you will sort of program different players.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, it's a good one. This is deep technical. So I've over the course of these 20 plus years, I've kind of, I would say, evolved a system where I have three subcategories of player: train to develop, train to compete, train to survive. And Sam and I laughed about this quite a lot in the most recent years. But anyway, train to develop, young players, low training age, low injury rates, low injury history, tons of energy, tons of enthusiasm, tons of testosterone. Pretty much full program, whatever we prescribe to them, they'll be able to adapt to the training demands and adapt to the training stress positively. Typically, you're kind of 17 to 23-year-old, just say. 23 or 24 to 29, you're in the peak of your career. You've got good physical prowess. You've developed that through your train to develop type years. Now, train to compete. The game at the weekend is really important. So in terms of doses, for example, it's not high volume, it's high quality. It's about the right amount in the right time on the right day, so that come Saturday, you're primed and ready to perform at your best this weekend. Because the next weekend, there's going to be another one of these opportunities, the next weekend, the next weekend, the next weekend. So there's a balance between being fresh and being prepared. So that's about getting what we need in the training week just right. So that would be a speed exposure. That'll obviously be a top up of fitness if they need that, if they haven't played the full 80 on the weekend. strength and power qualities will get, their gym time. And obviously there's still your tactical, technical training and your video analysis and all the other stuff that goes into preparing for the weekend. So that's your train to compete. Those guys are still now getting to the point where, in Sam's case, you've had a couple of injuries, you might have had a surgery. No doubt if you're playing professional level, I don't know any 29-year-old professional who hasn't had an operation. If there is one out there, Tim, just put it out there on the pod. Let me know, because I'm fascinated to know, genuinely. Anyway, you might have within that train to compete a slightly modified program for some. So what I mean by that, exercise selection may come into it. So players who might like to tow a sled or lift a hex bar might not squat anymore, for example. That would be one of the modifications, even within that train to compete group, which leads me nicely into train to survive, which would be you're 30-plus-year-old, you've played 100 times for a professional club, you're an international player if you've got to that status. You probably, you need way less volume of training because your training history is so long that maintaining physical qualities is much easier than developing physical qualities. So to get strong might take 5 years. To stay strong takes a couple of sets a week to maintain those physical qualities. So the demands are slightly different. But your train to survive is literally overseas players came into the teams I worked in. I can't do that. I can't do this. Can't do that. You've got to be way more creative with how you derive a speed and a strength stimulus, for example. So Julian White's a good example. Julian White didn't squat, didn't deadlift, but he pulled a heavy sled with up to 300 kilos for fun. But it didn't hurt him. It contributed to his game performance. Great. It's just a methodology, or it's just a modality to develop strength. And this is the one thing that I changed when I coached for a long period of time as well. Whether you squat, whether you deadlift, whether you tow a sled, whether you push a sled, whether you throw a med ball, they're just modalities to improve physical qualities that need to transfer to on-field performance. So for me, I don't care anymore, Tim, whether you squat or deadlift. I just want you as a player to develop strength. How you do that can be single leg variations. It can be sled pushing. There's a ton of stuff you can do. And that's what happens in Train to Survive. Just do something that's going to maintain or develop leg strength with a whole menu of exercises that you can choose from. But a bit like the Jason Spice analogy, just choose one. I don't care which one, just choose one and do it with diligence and consistency. That's what I want. And that was the Train to Survive group, which were, you need to run because you're going to play a sport that you need to run. Yes, we can develop your energy systems off beat if needs be. You can do some watt bike repeats, or you can do some other work. But ultimately, it's still a running-based sport with collision. So we have to protect you against collision, and we have to maintain your physical qualities for as long as possible, because then you'll be able to express them on the field, which is where you want to express them and play well week in, week out. So some players, like I say, did very, very little training, but they were such good rugby players. That's where they expressed themselves and did exceptionally well, because that's what they're paid to do, play rugby. All the other things that go into that help them play rugby for longer. And it's how you kind of put all those menu items together is, I guess, the secret sauce of good coaching, which is on the start line at 3:00 on Saturday, all these 23 people might have done something subtly different. Yes, team training is team training and they do everything together, but units, video analysis, strength work, power work, speed work, extra physiotherapy, whatever it might be. Some players were on the physio bed for the whole week and played like Tarzan. It's like, that's what preparation is about. Getting to the start line week in, week out. And week in, week out, Tim, trust me, there's a lot of firefighting to do in elite sport. There's players, and you've got to just sometimes do the best you can in a week with very, very constrained environment. But that's part of the challenge of adaptability and coaching. It's like not every week's going to be the same for every single player. Very few players went through a season totally without injury. Very few, if any. Not in rugby. It's too competitive. So
yeah, for sure. Now, somebody who definitely did suffer his fair share of injuries, I'd love to know what his Train to Survive was like, and that is Sam. What was his Train to Survive sessions?
Yeah, well, I mean, week in, week out, we've obviously planned a year, and we plan a month, and we plan a week. Sam was an incredibly diligent player. So I think most people who know him, he was known for his physical prowess, and anyone who watched him play knows that he was the target of, multiple people at multiple rucks across a game, week in, week out, which is why he played the game the way he did. But he still, from academy age group through that train to compete, through into the train to survive, really, really enjoyed the process of training, enjoyed his strength and conditioning. He enjoyed strength and power training and the confidence that brought for performance. So there was lots of different things that we did put into his program. Yes, when he was an academy player, he had an incredible squat. He was incredibly fast. He still was at the end of his career, but ultimately less volume. Tim, to answer your question, less volume. He was a very fast twitch athlete. What that basically means is he had more kind of sprinting capabilities than he had endurance capabilities. So even as a 7, we had to kind of top up the repeated speed ability of Sam. He still loved doing his speed, his strength, and his power work in the gym. It was just about exercise selection. He still did minimum 2 gym sessions a week, probably throughout his career. Week in, week out for the whole of his career, I'd say a minimum of 2 and probably sometimes 3 a week, depending on which weeks, because he was another one who also played probably heavier. His brother's, his identical twin is about 83 kilos. Sam played at about 102 to 105. So in terms of sort of, not saying he was a manufactured player by any stretch, but in terms of holding muscle mass, he probably holds 20 kilos more muscle mass than his brother, who's an identical twin. So Sam needed strength and conditioning and power to maintain his muscle mass. So he always had to do gym. And obviously, like I say, mentally, I think, and I'm not speaking on his behalf, I know him pretty well. Mentally, I'd say the confidence of preparing as exceptionally well and diligently as possible allowed him to go into matches with that confidence to be destructive at the breakdown and be that physical threat that he was. So that, 2 a week minimum. But the modifications would be less volume and a different level of exercise selection from train to survive, from train to compete. He probably didn't bench press after he was, he retired at 28, 29. So he probably wouldn't have bench pressed past 25. He'd have done dumbbells or he'd have done some heavy press ups with weights on his back, whatever it might be. So you just work around some of the limitations and modifications. And that's part of, like I say, the coaching process in conjunction with the conversation with a player. We don't want to hurt the players in training. They get hurt enough on the field. So it's things that you can do that are going to prepare you for your battle, but also protect you from, like I say, the collision element of the game.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's take a little jump across continents over to the USA. First of all, how did you get over there? What was the opportunity? And then just tell me a little bit what it was like living in the Pacific Northwest, which is one of the most beautiful parts of the world, in my opinion.
It is. You're absolutely right. No, blessed, absolutely blessed. Well, 2 things happened. So first thing happened, I married an American, which was good timing from my point of view, because I ended up being able to get a green card and obviously the opportunity to travel to the US in the first place. So Leicester Tigers, Cardiff Blues, 10 years at Cardiff Blues, lots of different reasons. Contract kind of came to an end and I thought, do you know what? Let's give America a go. And this was way, way before Major League Rugby had kind of come to fruition. So the first time I went to the US, I went to a company in the Pacific Northwest, which was named after Serevi. So Serevi Rugby, which then rebranded to a company called Atavus, was a commercial business essentially tasked with growing rugby in North America from the Pacific Northwest. There was an ownership group who loved rugby, Americans. One of the boys' sons had travelled to the UK to study. I think he was an Oxford Blue or maybe a Cambridge Blue. I know that's terrible to get it the wrong way around. But anyway, he'd studied at Oxbridge and he fell in love with rugby. And he was essentially looking to grow rugby in North America. So I first went out there to do that in 2014, 2015. And for lots of different reasons, had a baby in Seattle and moved back to Cardiff because my wife at the time wanted to be nearer her family. So that was the first time. But yes, to live in the Pacific Northwest and Seattle particularly is absolutely beautiful. Stunning part of America. If anybody asks me now about Seattle, I'm like, it's absolutely beautiful place. But then the second time round, I had just gone through a year or 2 in university, and I had a phone call from the owner of Atavus Rugby, saying, do you want to come back to do the strength and conditioning for the Major League Rugby team? They'd just come off the back of winning Major League Rugby in the inaugural season and the season after, so they've gone back-to-back champions. There was only 7 teams in the professional league in the first year. I think there were 9 teams in the professional league in the second year. I went into year 3, dreaded 2020, COVID year. We got 5 games into 2020 before the season and lockdown occurred. So my first season had literally been pre-season and 5 games, and then it got shut down like everybody else in the world. I went back in 2021 and did the full season, pre-season and a 16-game regular season and playoffs. I don't believe we made the playoffs in 2021. But amazing. I mean, the growth trajectory of Major League Rugby has been pretty steep since the beginning, 2017 to now, 2024 seasons just about to. Boys are going to go back into training camps imminently, December time. It's still going, but it still needs a level of, you could imagine in America, one, the country's absolutely enormous. Playing an away game in Washington, D.C., for example, was a 6-hour transcontinental flight over 3 time zones. You leave Seattle, you get to Washington, you're 3 time zones ahead. You've then got a 3,000-mile journey. You sleep in a hotel bed, you go to the stadium, you play the game, you hot-foot it back out again. You've literally, if you said to me, Tim, I want to play, I mean, I'm in Cardiff now, you say, I want to go and play rugby in Dubai Saturday, and you're just going to go in on Friday, you're going to play Saturday, you're going to come home Sunday, you're going to go, hold on a minute, are you crazy? That is essentially what playing Seattle, Washington is in terms of flight times. So in context, It's really, really hard in America. This is maybe going slightly off topic, but on topic. The hardest challenge I think American rugby has is the continent is so big. Connecting all the pathways into a system is so difficult because you've got Atlanta, Georgia, you've got New York, you've got Miami, you've got San Diego, you've got Seattle. They're thousands of miles away from each other. So kind of connecting the rugby dots in North America is really, really hard. They're starting to shape it, but they've been talking about starting to shape it for about 25 years. It's just a really, really hard project to try and get everybody aligned on the same page to make rugby as powerful as some of the other legacy sports in America. Those big 4, basketball, baseball, ice hockey, and American football are just huge in the men's side. But the women's side are making headway because there's this thing called Title IX in collegiate sport, which is for every dollar you spend on a man, you've got to spend on a woman. So there's much more opportunity for the women's pathway to be successful because there's some equal kind of investment on both sides which is great. But experience-wise, Tim, absolutely brilliant. Loved it. Do you know what I love the most? When you're lucky enough to be in a position that I was in, which was, supporting players in a full stadium at Twickenham or the Millennium Stadium, to go to America, and Seattle were well supported, but their stadium held 5,000. So it was a much more sort of smaller scale, less pressurized week-to-week environment for professional rugby. So it was great. It was also kind of stepping back 10, 15 years. And that, like I say, that trajectory of professionalism could be very, very interesting, how they kind of launch over the next few years, given that they've got World Cup rights in 31 and 33. I'd love to see what kind of strategic plan has gone into place for making sure when the showcase spectacles in America in 7 years' time now, 8 years' time, that it's as good as the Rugby World Cup we've just witnessed in France. Do you know what I mean? There's a massive project ahead for somebody.
Yeah, for sure. Now, there's been several attempts to start professional rugby in the USA previously that have failed. Why is MLR still going? What have been the things? What have been the things that they've got right this time that they didn't before?
Owners with deep pockets? No, I don't. I mean, Tim, it's a good question. I mean, that was a relatively facetious answer, but I think it always boils down to people, right? I think there are people within the major league organization and the ownership groups who really want it to be successful. And if you really want it to be successful, then maybe they'll just come to the table with a little bit more tenacity, I suppose, and a little bit more financial horsepower to make that work. And I'm not sure what the ownership, of teams looks like, but I understand that, running a professional sports team in America is not a cheap process. Same with anything in, elite sport in the world. It's, the cost of entry is relatively expensive for everyday Joe. So I think that might be one. And I just think now that the snowball's gathering a little bit of momentum, there is an influx of interest. The social media platforms have made viewing American rugby more attractive. Some very good young talent is coming into the league from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the UK. I mean, some of the teams have got some incredibly good, homegrown talent alongside overseas players. Good coaching from all over the world. I mean, it is very multicultural leagues. I mean, I'm sure there'll be an influx of South American players as well. Hopefully some Portuguese and some Chileans, having watched them play in the Rugby World Cup. There's opportunity to have a real impact. So there he is.
There's the dog.
There he is. I told you he'd bark at one point. We're nearly 50 in, so it is what it is. No, but I think that's why. I think leadership-wise, they've got people who really want it to be successful, and I think that's important. And I think they will. They'll drive. I mean, it's into year 7 now, and I think it's got enough legs to continue. So, and there is that North Star, which is the World Cup in 31 for the men's program, which I think will drive continued investment into it.
Yeah, that's huge for sure. Okay, let's come back over this side of the world. We mentioned it sort of towards the top of the show. What is the SW7 Academy and what's your role within it, Chris?
Brilliant. Yeah, so I'm head coach head of performance, at SW7 Academy. So Sam and his founding partner, Josh Davis, before I was involved, so I was taking 2 steps back. I was in Seattle in Major League Rugby, and Sam and Josh founded SW7 Academy. And I guess the premise of the organisation is to provide online the best possible strength and conditioning services so that people who are aspiring players have the opportunities that Sam had, essentially. We're not exclusively a platform for rugby players, but inevitably aspiring rugby players are a core market for us. We have basically an online presence when it comes to strength and conditioning programs from aspiring players through to 30-plus-year-old males who want to get themselves back into shape or continue to play rugby into their latter years. And we have female-only programs as well that are obviously targeting female sports players particularly. So we're basically trying to offer the best possible strength and conditioning services for anybody who wants to take their health and fitness seriously for the remainder of their, what I call athlete for life years, which are, forever. But I mean, that's it. I mean, I have clients who I look after. One is 10, and one's 61. So I have a breadth of programming to do, which, going back to my train to survive analogy, anyone past 35 is probably the train to survive category. But no, we obviously offer online provision of service. We've dipped our toe and now are expanding into other markets as well. We've got a schools offering where we go in and look after schools provision of service for athletic development, especially given that some schools don't have provision of staff within their schools to look after that particular element. We've got a corporate kind of offering which looks after businesses who want to have a healthier staff, and we've got a new SW7 Academy kind of studio, which is a very small, actual, real space for us to train, a very small number of kind of athletes in person. So we're kind of athlete facing, but we're also very much dominating the digital space.
Amazing. That sounds great. Now, this might be a difficult question to answer, but just for the amateur rugby player, your average amateur rugby player, what are some of the things they should be thinking about in terms of their SNC? Maybe just how they should think about it, or whatever you think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the hardest thing for me, and this may be coming from a professional background, might sound obvious, but the hardest thing to enjoy playing a game at the weekend is if you're not conditioned, you're going to be in for a miserable time. So let's start with the end in mind and work our way back. So I guess if I was going to be talking to an amateur group of players, I'd say speed, strength, and power qualities are going to make you enjoy the best part of the week that much more. So if you want to enjoy the game, if you and I, Tim, are both centres, for example, and I'm going to play against you, I know, I'm the same. If we're going to play against each other, rugby union particularly is a work rate game. Even if I have to outwork you to open up an opportunity for someone else within my team, the next man has to outwork his opposite number to make an opportunity for our team. So what I'm trying to say is take your fitness for rugby some kind of seriously so that you can actually enjoy the outcome of training so that you play and enjoy playing. And you don't have to win every week to enjoy playing. I totally respect that and I understand that. But what I also do think is strength and conditioning is really important for two things. Performance enhancement, being better at your sport, and also, importantly, in rugby particularly, injury prevention. So I would just say to an amateur player, before you do your club training on a Tuesday or a Thursday, warm up really well and do some speed work, because speed qualities are really important irrespective of position. If you're a front row forward, do 5 sets of 10 reps, 5 sets of 10 meters acceleration, because you don't need to be running 50-meter efforts, because chances are if you make a line break, nobody's going to be chasing you for 50 meters. They might chase you for 5 and then they'll catch you. So do your acceleration work before club training. So that ticks the speed box. It doesn't have to be hours and hours of training. It might be 15 to 20 minutes. I'd say the same to the outside backs. Run some 40s, run some 50s after you've done your warm-up. It's going to take you 10 to 15 minutes. And I'd say the same for the sort of inside backs in the back row. And then I'd say just for your own protection, do 2 really good 30 to 40 to maybe 45-minute weight sessions a week at some point, whether that's Monday and Wednesday or whether that's somewhere in the week. You've got to try and fit 2 weight sessions in, 2 club trainings, and then you play. That, for me, would be what most amateur rugby players have got the time to dedicate to their rugby program. I mean, there's obviously people who are going to have more time. There's going to be people who have less time. But that is what I'd say to an amateur rugby player. Do 2 weight sessions a week, have a speed exposure, and go to club training, and then you'll enjoy Saturday that much more, because you'll be in some kind of condition to play the game. And also then there's the kind of lifestyle factors that go into that. We both know that rugby lads love a beer. There's no issue with that. But instead of having 15, have 5. Little modifications. Little modifications can have a massive impact on how you enjoy the game and how much longer you can play the game into the latter end of your career. Some people, I love talking to players who still play. I talked to one last week. He's 43, still playing. And we had that kind of 1 more year conversation. And it was kind of funny, but also kind of endearing. It's like the guy doesn't want to let go, and that's absolutely fine. But also train to keep your body in one piece for as long as possible. But also habits-wise, like I said, train because it's going to contribute to rugby, but also it's going to contribute to your overall quality of life after rugby. And I know it's easy for me to say that, but I am 52 and I do take my training relatively seriously so that I can enjoy my pastimes with my kids and all that sort of stuff. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of embedding habits for now, but also embedding habits for later as well. That's kind of my philosophy on training generally anyway.
Yeah, some amazing advice there, Chris. That is absolutely brilliant. Okay, we'll bring this section of the show to a close now and move on to the stash section. So what is your favourite bit of stash that you've ever received, Chris?
Interestingly, and he is my boss, I have a signed Sam Warburton jersey. I never thought when I left the Cardiff Blues in 2013 that I would end up working with Sam in a business capacity. But, that's how relationships evolve, and that's how, our connection as athlete and coach came into fruition. So I have a signed Test jersey on my son's wall, actually, upstairs. I think that's probably my best stash, which is not for sale, by the way.
Yeah,
that'd be the number one, I think.
Okay, cool. And next question, what is your favourite kit of all time? So this can be any team from any era.
Um, when England was sponsored by Nike, I loved the England kit, the Nike stash. I've still got some Nike England shorts upstairs. The Welsh fans won't appreciate that, but I do. Super cool. The Nike England stash from I can't even remember. Was that the early 2000s? Maybe into
it would have been about
the late 2000s. Yeah,
Mm.
anything. I mean, I've got a boring story to share about Nike, but I'll save it for another day.
We'll save that for episode 2, maybe.
Yeah, no, nice.
And what about awful kit? What kits out there at the moment that you think are just disgusting?
Ooh, wow. There've been some pretty racy ones, haven't there? I think back to my little journey, and I remember when Cardiff was sponsored by Canterbury, we used to get a good stash. Leicester Tigers, given their success, and it is given the locality, they were cotton traders. Cotton traders wasn't the best stash, if I'm being brutally honest. Sorry, Leicester Tigers, and that sponsorship agreement from back in the day. Kits of now, I must start watching more rugby. I always used to think some of the French kits are a little bit gregarious, should we say, with their covered, aren't they, with sponsors? I think it would have been, well, not Montpellier, Clermont would have used to have that yellow, but emblazoned everywhere with sponsors from in and around the Pyrenees. I think that would be probably a garish gear. I mean, I used to like, when we used to play Stade Francais, I mean, Stade Francais is still a good side, but when Cardiff used to play Stade Francais, they used to have some pretty racy kit, always pink. I quite liked it. I mean, Cardiff played in pink in one year, but I think Stade Francais would have been probably the kit that people started to copy and emulate from a shirt sales perspective, because they used to put a fair bit of time into the design of their match day shirts.
Yeah, they changed the game really in that respect. That's for sure. Right then, Chris, as we bring this towards a close, is there anything else that you'd like to say, or any sort of closing thoughts on any of the topics that we've sort of spoken about today?
Tim, no, well, one, it's been great to go down memory lane and just go back to the Tigers days and some time in Cardiff and in the US. I mean, for me, I just appreciate the platform to sort of share my thoughts with the amateur players, because genuinely, I think, as someone who's worked at the professional end of rugby for so long, I do think that, rugby is a phenomenal sport that brings a lot of people together, and I love the values of the sport. But also, like I said, when you asked me about training, I genuinely think that training for the sport has massive implications to the enjoyment of the sport. So I think that would be my closing kind of, I guess, advice would be, take that side of it as seriously as you take the on-field stuff, because it'll allow you to enjoy the game for longer.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Okay, everything we've mentioned, people listening, will be linked in the show notes, which can be found in one place at amateurrugbypodcast.com. And it just leaves me to say, Chris, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Amazing. Okay, there he goes. Thanks again to Chris. Some really great advice there for the amateur players, and some amazing stories as well from the professional game. Now it's coming up to Christmas. So if you want a list of great rugby gifts for Christmas players, go to amateurrugbypodcast.com/Xmas for my curated list of gifts. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, you could do all the social media stuff, all that stuff that I like. But what I'd really like is if you mention it to someone in person the next time you're down your local rugby club. And until then, get out and play.